I had been planning the hunting trip for months, telling myself it would be a good break from work and the crowded life of the city. I wanted real quiet, something I hadn't felt in years. By early November of 2017, I had finally made enough space in my schedule to take a long weekend away. I drove up to a remote part of northern Minnesota, closer to the Canadian border than anything I would call civil. The land up there felt untouched, and the cold always arrived early. I thought the low temperatures and the long drive would keep most people away, which was exactly what I wanted. The cabin I chose wasn't anything special. It was an old hunting place built in the late 1970s, sitting alone near a thick forest of tall pines and leafless birch trees. The roof was dark green metal, rusted at the edges. The porch had uneven steps, and the whole place leaned slightly to the right as if it was slowly giving up after so many winters. I didn't care how it looked. I just needed shelter, a wood stove, and a place to rest after long hours in the woods. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun had already started dropping, and the air felt heavy in a way that warned of snow. I unpacked my gear, carried everything inside, and checked the place from corner to corner. The cabin had one main room with a small kitchen, a narrow hallway, and a single bedroom in the back. There was no electricity except for a shaky generator out behind the shed, which I only planned to use for an hour or two at night. The wood stove sat near the center of the room, blackened from years of use. The smell of old timber and cold dust filled the air. I spent the first hour cutting kindling, stacking logs near the stove, and getting the fire going until the room finally warmed enough for me to take off my jacket. I looked through the windows and saw nothing but woods in every direction. No houses, no lights, no roads. The only sound was the soft crackling of the fire and the distant, almost too distant, wind. I set out early the next morning. The ground was hard, frozen enough to make each step crunch under my boots. The sky was pale and empty. I moved deeper into the forest, following no specific path, just letting my instincts control where I went. The air smelled like pine sap and cold dirt, and the silence felt deep enough that even breathing sounded too loud. Hours passed with nothing but tracks. Deer, maybe a fox or two, but nothing worth aiming at. That didn't bother me. I wasn't there just to hunt. I wanted the quiet. Around midday, I noticed something odd. While moving west from the cabin, I found a broken tree trunk with deep scratches along the side. The marks were clean, straight lines, the kind made by something sharp, maybe metal. It didn't look like an animal. The cuts were too deliberate. I stood there for a minute, running my glove across the grooves. Something about it bothered me, but I pushed it out of my mind and kept walking. By late afternoon, a heavy gray cloud layer formed over the woods, and I decided to head back. The temperature dropped fast, and with the sky darkening, the forest felt tighter and smaller with every step. When I reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the door. I remembered closing it before leaving. I was sure of it because it had a stiff hinge that required force to shut fully. But now it sat slightly open, like someone had pushed it but didn't close it all the way. I stood still for a long moment, listening. The cold air moved through the trees, but the cabin stayed quiet. My first thought was that I must have been careless earlier, maybe rushing to leave. I tried telling myself that even when it didn't feel true. Still, I walked inside slowly, scanning everything. Nothing looked moved. My gear sat where I placed it. The firewood pile remained untouched. The stove was dead cold, just as I left it. I checked the bedroom, then the hallway, then under the bed. Nothing. I closed the door firmly, latched it, and slid a heavy piece of firewood against it just for my own peace of mind. I spent the evening near the stove, reading old notes I found stuffed in a drawer near the kitchen. They were from hunters who stayed there years ago. Most of them wrote about the weather or how good the deer population was. A couple mentioned coyotes coming close to the cabin at night, but that was normal anywhere in the north. Nothing stood out. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped again, and the wind grew stronger. Every few minutes, a branch snapped outside, but I knew that could be anything. Cold makes the trees crack and pop. Still, every sound felt sharper. I tried to sleep, but it didn't come easy. I lay in the bedroom, staring at the wooden ceiling, trying not to look toward the window next to the bed. It was covered by a thin curtain that fluttered slightly every time a draft slipped through the old frame. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Everything was dark except the faint orange glow from the dying fire in the other room. I lay there breathing slowly, trying to figure out what pulled me out of sleep. After a moment, I heard it, a soft crunch outside. Not wind, not branches, footsteps, and not the pacing kind animals make. These were spaced, slow, heavy enough to sink slightly into the frozen ground. For a full minute, I didn't move. I stared at the ceiling and listened. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped somewhere near the back, close to the bedroom wall. I held my breath, waiting for the next sound. Nothing came. The silence outside grew heavier than before, like the air thickened around the cabin. I stayed awake until morning, barely moving. When the sun finally rose, I got dressed quickly and went outside. My breath came out in long clouds, and the ground around the cabin glittered with frost. I walked around the cabin slowly and saw what I didn't want to see. Prints. Large boot prints, fresh ones, circling the building. They were clear, detailed, and recent, made sometime during the night. I crouched down and touched one. The earth inside the print was still soft compared to the frozen dirt around it. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. I backed toward the cabin and went inside to pack my things. I didn't even think about staying another night. I started loading my gear into the truck as fast as I could, glancing toward the tree line every few seconds. I kept expecting to see someone standing there, just out of sight, waiting. When everything was packed, I walked around one last time to make sure I didn't forget anything. That was when I noticed something else. Near one of the windows under the bedroom, the dirt was disturbed. Not footprints, kneeling marks, as if someone had crouched there for a long time, as if someone had been watching me through the thin curtain while I slept. I didn't waste another second. I got into the truck, locked the doors, and started driving. The forest looked different as I left. The trees felt closer. The silence felt heavier. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting a figure to step out onto the road behind me. Nothing appeared, but the feeling didn't go away, not even miles later. When I reached the small town an hour south, I finally felt like I could breathe. I stopped at the gas station, stepped out, and looked at the sky just to remind myself I was back around people. But the unease stayed with me. It stayed with me the entire drive home. It stayed even after I reached the city and locked my apartment door. It stays with me now. Nothing supernatural happened. Nothing impossible. It was just a person. A real person out in those woods, circling that old hunting cabin in the dark, watching. Maybe they lived somewhere nearby. Maybe they wandered through the forest. Maybe they waited for hunters. I will never know who they were or what they wanted. But I know this. Someone else had plans for that night, and those plans involved me. If I hadn't woken up when I did, if I had stepped outside after hearing the first sound, if I had left the door unlocked, maybe the story would have ended differently. The cabin is still there. I haven't gone back. I won't. Some places are meant to stay empty. Some silences are warnings, and some footsteps in the dark follow you much longer than the sound they make. I remember the first time I saw that cabin. It was late autumn, 1997, and I had driven down a narrow, winding dirt road deep in the forests outside Coeur d'Alene. Idaho. I was 28, just out of college and carrying a camera and a notebook, determined to get some peace for writing and hiking. I wasn't expecting much, just a quiet place away from the city. But the moment I turned a sharp bend and the cabin came into view, I felt an odd twist of unease in my chest. It looked abandoned from a distance, a small, wooden structure barely clinging to life among the twisted pines and fallen leaves. The roof sagged in the middle, shingles were missing, and vines crept up the sides like the forest itself was swallowing it. The path leading to it had been long overgrown, with branches scraping the sides of my car, and the dirt was soft, almost muddy. By the time I reached the clearing, I had to park some distance away and walk. The air was sharp with cold, and the smell of wet pine and decaying leaves made my nose wrinkle. The forest felt heavy, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It pressed against your ears. Even though the wind rattled the tops of the trees, it seemed like the air inside the clearing barely moved. The cabin's front door hung crookedly on one hinge. I pushed it open slowly. The wood creaked so loudly it felt like it would announce me to the whole forest. Inside, the air was damp and stale, smelling of mold and rot, mixed with something I couldn't place at first. The floorboards sagged and groaned under my weight, and dust floated in the beams of sunlight that struggled through the broken windows. I ran my hand over the rough walls, feeling old nails and splintered wood beneath my fingers. The place hadn't seen human life in years, maybe decades. I walked through the main room first. There was nothing but a broken table, a few chairs missing legs, and a collapsed stove in the corner. The plaster on the walls had fallen in chunks, revealing dark, decayed wood underneath. Across the room, the remnants of a small fireplace were blackened with years of soot, though it hadn't been used in a long time. I stepped closer to it, noticing scratch marks in the ashes, old but jagged, as though someone or something had clawed at the floor before disappearing. My heart beat a little faster. I told myself it was probably an animal, likely a raccoon or some kind of rodent. I explored further, finding a narrow staircase leading to a loft. Each step groaned dangerously, making me second-guess climbing. The loft was low, and the ceiling slanted close to my head. The space was littered with rotting blankets and empty glass bottles, some shattered. I knelt and looked at them, noticing old dirt and mold that had eaten into the labels, leaving them unrecognizable. There were old newspapers scattered, dating back to the early 1960s. I picked one up carefully, the paper brittle and yellowed. I read a few lines, noting the small-town news about harvests and local events. Nothing about the cabin itself. But the more I looked, the more I realized the place had been frozen in time, left exactly as it had been 50 years ago. I spent a few hours just moving around, taking notes and photos, trying to shake the creeping sense of unease that kept curling in my stomach. The deeper I went into the cabin, the more I noticed the small details that made my skin crawl. The uneven, jagged edges of splintered wood, the dark stains along the floor that didn't look like water, the way the shadows seemed to gather in the corners of rooms. I couldn't see anything moving, and yet the atmosphere felt charged, heavy, like the air itself had a memory. In one corner of the main room, I discovered a trapdoor partially hidden under a loose floorboard. I hesitated, the air suddenly cold against my neck. The hinge groaned as I lifted it, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. I didn't have a flashlight on me, but my curiosity outweighed my caution. The first step was loose. It shifted under my weight, sending a cascade of dust into the air. I paused, listening, but there was only the dull echo of my own movements and the creak of old wood. The basement, or whatever it was, smelled worse than the rest of the cabin. A choking mix of rot, earth, and something metallic. My flashlight from my bag illuminated broken tools, rusted cans, and a small pile of human-sized sacks that had rotted into dust. The walls were lined with cracks, and the floor had large sections missing, revealing the dirt below. Then I noticed the marks along the walls, deep gouges and smears of dark material. Not scratches, but scraping, as if someone had tried to dig or pull something into the walls themselves. The thought made my stomach tighten. I had the sudden, distinct impression that people had once been here, working in secret, hiding or storing things, though I couldn't make out what. I spent another hour moving through the cabin, checking every corner, making sure I wasn't imagining things. I photographed the basement, the loft, and every broken window. The sun was getting lower, spilling long orange streaks through the broken panes. I could feel the cold starting to seep in through the gaps in the walls. I decided it was time to leave, but then I realized something. My car wasn't where I left it. My heart jumped. I walked back toward the clearing, and the dirt road looked different somehow, more like a maze of shadows and undergrowth. I paused and looked around. The forest was quiet now, unnaturally so. No birds, no wind in the treetops, just the sharp snapping of twigs under my feet. I turned back toward the cabin. That's when I noticed tire tracks, small and narrow, leading from the road to a patch of mud I hadn't seen before. I realized someone had been here recently, though the cabin seemed empty. Someone had moved around the perimeter, maybe scouting. I felt a cold, rational fear. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with evidence that someone else had been here, watching. I ran back to the cabin, gathering my things, my camera, and my notebook. I didn't bother exploring the basement further. I bolted down the dirt road, branches slapping at my jacket, heart hammering. My car was where I'd parked it, thankfully, though I double-checked the doors and started the engine without looking back. The drive back to the highway felt endless, the forest pressing in on both sides. When I finally reached Coeur d'Alene, the normal sounds of the town, the cars, the wind chimes, even the faint hum of distant voices, felt surreal, almost foreign. I parked at my small apartment, locked the doors, and sat with my notes and photographs spread out. I reviewed them carefully. Nothing explained the marks in the basement. Nothing explained why the place had felt alive in its silence, like it remembered. I never went back to that cabin, and I never told anyone exactly where it was. Over the years, I realized the fear I felt wasn't supernatural. It was the knowledge that people had lived or worked there in secret, that something had happened, and the forest had swallowed the evidence. That sense of the unknown, the tangible history pressed into decayed wood and dirt, stayed with me. It made me careful when I hiked into abandoned places after that, but it also reminded me why I explored them at all. The thrill of seeing something left behind, frozen in time, and feeling the echo of lives that had once been there. Sometimes, when I'm out hiking now, I think about that cabin. I picture the sagging roof, the crooked door, the basement with its dark, clawed walls. I don't want to go back, but I remember the clarity that day gave me. The world is full of secrets left in the corners, in abandoned houses and old cabins. And some of them, if you see them too closely, will leave a memory you can't shake. Real, human, and utterly haunting. I had spent years in the city, drowning in the noise, the endless flicker of neon lights, and the constant hum of other people's lives. But one late September, I decided to step away from all of it. I wanted quiet, solitude, and a place where the only sound was the wind through the trees. That's how I ended up driving down a narrow, cracked dirt road in northern Vermont, in a 1978 Chevy Nova that had been in my family for years, until I spotted the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was 2001, and I was 32, more restless than ever. The cabin itself was no more than a modest shack, maybe 20 by 20 feet, built from rough pine logs that had weathered a few decades. Moss crept along the corners and shingles, and the windows were grimy, yellowed with age but otherwise intact. Behind it lay a graveyard, tiny and overgrown, with uneven headstones leaning in every direction. I'd read about it in an old county record book, the Salem family plot, dating back to the late 1800s. Most of the stones were eroded beyond recognition. I didn't care. I just wanted a place where I could stay for a week, alone, and write. The air was crisp as I unpacked my bag and stacked firewood in a pile near the cabin's small stone fireplace. I had brought a lantern, canned food, and a duffel bag full of notebooks. The trees creaked in the wind, and the sun dropped behind the hills faster than I expected. By 6 p.m, the forest had swallowed most of the light, leaving a gray haze that made the cabin appear both more inviting and more isolated. I spent the first few hours inside organizing my supplies and noting down observations. The cabin smelled of old pine and damp earth. There were cobwebs in every corner, dust layers thick enough to make patterns on my notebook if I brushed my hands across them. I lit a small fire in the fireplace, and the warmth seemed to push back the chill settling into my bones. Night came quickly. I was writing when a sudden, sharp crack echoed from the graveyard. My pen froze. I listened. The sound came again, then again. A slow, deliberate cracking, like someone stepping carefully on dry branches. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the sound didn't wander off. It stayed in the graveyard. I peered out the window, trying to see through the darkness, but the trees cast deep shadows over the leaning stones. I could see nothing. Around midnight, the wind shifted, carrying a new scent, something metallic, like rust and wet soil. My heart rate quickened, and I moved closer to the window. In the weak light of my lantern, I thought I saw movement among the graves. Not human-shaped, not distinct, but the sort of movement that made the mind try to form shapes it shouldn't. I shut the curtain and turned back to my notes, pretending I didn't notice. Pretending seemed safer than admitting fear. The next morning, I woke to find the ground around the cabin trampled. The firewood pile I had stacked neatly the day before was scattered, logs pushed in various directions. I couldn't see tracks, no footprints, no tire marks, but the earth had an uneven look, as if something had walked around in circles. I felt a tension in my chest I couldn't shake. I spent the day chopping more wood and clearing a small path toward the edge of the graveyard. I wanted to see it in daylight to prove to myself it was harmless. The stones were in rough condition. Moss and vines had taken over most of them, and the inscriptions were nearly illegible. The ground was soft and muddy in places from recent rains. I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Shallow holes, dug hastily, about the size of a small animal grave, but none of them had a marker or stone. They were random, scattered. By evening, the cabin felt suffocating. The sounds of the forest were louder now, amplified by my isolation. Branches tapped against the roof, the wind whistled through gaps in the logs, and occasionally there was that cracking noise again from the graveyard. I tried to distract myself by reading, cooking, doing anything that kept my eyes off the window. I couldn't ignore it completely. Every time the lantern flickered, I imagined movement outside. The third night, the temperature dropped dramatically. I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and huddled near the fire. The cracking noises were persistent now, slower but deliberate, coming from different directions. Sometimes it sounded closer. At one point, I swore I heard the scrape of a shovel against dirt. My imagination ran wild, picturing someone digging graves in the dead of night. But the thought made no sense. Why would anyone come here, so deep in the woods, to dig in a graveyard that had been abandoned for decades? I didn't sleep. I could hear small things moving outside, dragging, scraping, sniffing. The forest had a smell of wet leaves and decay, thick in the cold air. My mind refused to let me rest. I spent the hours listening, trying to convince myself of logical explanations. Animals, branches falling, the wind, but nothing fit exactly. By sunrise, I knew I had to face it. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The graveyard was empty. The holes were deeper, with loose soil around them. One of the smaller stones had been pushed over. My pulse was racing, and I felt exposed in the open, but I moved closer to investigate. I found tracks, human tracks, boots, medium size. They crisscrossed the muddy earth, circling and recircling, stopping abruptly near certain graves. Whoever it was had been here the night before, walking carefully, almost ritualistically. Fear hit me then, a cold, calculated fear. This wasn't imagination. Someone had been here, and judging by the state of the ground, they weren't finished. I hurried back to the cabin, locked the door, and stayed near the fireplace all morning, keeping my eyes on the window. I considered calling the sheriff, but there was no cell reception out there. The nearest road was miles away. The next day, I packed everything I could and decided to leave before nightfall. I dragged the last of my supplies into the car, glancing constantly at the graveyard, expecting to see someone lurking among the stones. But there was nothing, just the gray, quiet stillness of the forest. As I drove down the dirt road, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Later, I would learn what had been happening. The area had been used by local scavengers and grave robbers, people searching for old coins or relics from unmarked graves. It explained the holes, the disturbed stones, the tracks. They had probably seen me from a distance, too, and had moved off once I stayed inside the cabin. It was a rational explanation, grounded in reality, but knowing that real people had been there, silently moving among graves in the dark, made the memory linger longer than any imagined ghost could. Even now, years later, I can't drive through northern Vermont without thinking of that small cabin and the graveyard behind it. The experience left me with a sharper sense of awareness and an understanding of how isolation can twist the simplest, logical explanations into paralyzing fear. But it also taught me something else. The world can be scary, not because of the supernatural, but because of real people and the unknown choices they make in places no one watches. I never returned to that cabin. I don't even know if it's still standing. But sometimes, when I feel too secure in my daily life, I think about that place. The cracked logs, the cold wind, the small, deliberate footprints circling the graves, and I realize fear doesn't need a ghost. It only needs a reason to remind you that the world is bigger than you, and sometimes dangerous in ways you might never predict. It was the autumn of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the city. I was 29, tired of the constant noise, the endless honking, and the sense that everyone was moving too fast while I stayed behind. I had always loved the idea of building something with my own hands, and when I found a small plot of land tucked deep in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania, I couldn't resist. It wasn't much, just a few acres surrounded by thick pine and maple trees, but it was far enough from the main roads that I knew no one would bother me. The land had a shallow creek running along the back, its water blackened by fallen leaves, and a natural clearing perfect for a small cabin. I started late September, right after the first frost had touched the ground. The air was crisp in the morning, and the smell of wet earth filled my lungs as I unpacked my tools. I had a modest toolkit: a hammer, some nails, a saw, a hand drill, a couple of axes, and a chainsaw I borrowed from a neighbor back in the nearest town, which was nearly 30 miles away. My plan was simple: a small one-room cabin, just enough for a bed, a stove, and some shelves. Nothing fancy, just a place to sleep and work while I spent a few weeks disconnected from everything else. The first few days were physically exhausting. I cut logs from fallen trees, cleared brush, and leveled the ground for a foundation. The land was uneven, sloping slightly toward the creek, so I had to dig trenches and fill them with stone to keep the cabin from tilting. By the 5th day, I had the frame up and I started placing the walls. The sound of the hammer hitting nails echoed through the trees, bouncing off the trunks like distant thunder. Nights were cold, and I had to light a small fire just to keep my hands from going numb while I slept in a tent beside the half-built cabin. I worked mostly alone, except for a stray dog I had taken in for company. I named him Rust, a lean, black and tan mutt that followed me from the road and refused to leave. He was quiet, except for the occasional bark at a squirrel or a crow, and his presence was strangely comforting. He would curl up beside me on the cold ground while I planned the next day's work, and his warmth reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. By the 3rd week, the roof was nearly complete, and I had nailed rough planks for walls. I had a small window cut into the front, just enough to let in light, and a makeshift door that closed snugly. That night, as I finished tightening the last bolts, I noticed dark clouds rolling in from the west. The wind picked up, and a fine drizzle began. I should have stopped and gone back to town, but the temptation to stay and finish was too strong. By midnight, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain, and the wind shook the cabin like it might collapse at any moment. I was inside, sitting on a plank that I had used for a makeshift bench, listening to the rain pound on the roof. The sound was deafening, a constant drumming that made the cabin feel alive and menacing at the same time. The floor was slick with mud tracked in from outside, and I could hear the creek swelling with the rainwater, the sound of rushing water growing louder as the night wore on. Rust lay close to me, ears twitching at every snap of a branch in the distance. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it, a cracking sound, sharp and close. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, and I strained to hear over the rain. It wasn't thunder. It was something else, like the sound of a heavy branch breaking. I grabbed my flashlight and leaned toward the window, peering into the blackness outside. The trees swayed violently, and a massive pine had fallen across the creek, splintering on impact. Water from the creek surged over the rocks, flooding the low-lying areas near the cabin. I realized how close I had come to being trapped. I spent the rest of the night shoving sandbags around the cabin, trying to keep the rising water at bay. Rust stayed alert, growling at shadows cast by the flashlight, his instincts sharper than mine. I hadn't seen another human all day, but I wasn't entirely alone. The forest seemed full of hidden movement. Animals mostly, but the sound of branches snapping, leaves rustling, and the occasional splash from the creek made me question how safe I really was out there. Morning came and the rain finally stopped. I stepped outside to assess the damage. The creek had widened, swallowing part of the path I had cleared to the road. Mud coated the ground, and fallen branches blocked what little trail remained. My cabin had held up, though some shingles were ripped off the roof and the walls were streaked with muddy water. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was alive. Rust barked once and ran toward the creek, sniffing at a fallen log. The rest of that week was spent repairing the cabin, reinforcing the walls, and clearing debris from the path. I realized that building a cabin wasn't just about sawing wood and hammering nails. It was about understanding the land, respecting it, and preparing for its unexpected fury. The forest could be violent, indifferent, and unpredictable. I learned to pay attention to the small signs. How the wind moved through the trees, the smell of the soil before a storm, and the sound of the creek before it flooded. By the end of October, the cabin was finished. It was small, simple, and smelled of fresh pine and sawdust. I had a small stove for heat and cooking, a cot with a thin mattress, and a few shelves to store my supplies. The rain had come and gone several more times, each storm testing the strength of my work. Each night, I lay awake listening to the rain, feeling the cabin creak under the wind and wondering what else could go wrong. But I always woke up to the sound of Rust nudging me for breakfast, and the sunlight filtering through the trees, warm and reassuring. One particular morning, after a week-long storm had passed, I walked to the edge of the creek. The water was lower, the fallen pines sawed into logs to use as firewood, and the forest felt calm. The work had taken its toll on me physically, but it had also changed me in ways I didn't expect. I felt a deep connection to the land, a sense of accomplishment that went beyond any praise or recognition from the outside world. I had faced the storm and I had survived it. I had built something with my hands that could withstand nature's worst, and I had learned that resilience wasn't just about strength, but about patience, observation, and care. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin, this time for a longer stay. I had packed books, food, and extra blankets, planning to spend a month alone. The cabin was quiet except for the creek and the occasional rustle of wildlife. The nights were dark, filled with the wind and the distant call of owls, but I felt safe. The storms would come again, surely, but I knew now how to handle them. I could reinforce the walls, clear the path, and keep Rust close. By the time I left in late November, the cabin stood firm, a small testament to endurance and solitude. I felt proud not because I had conquered the land, but because I had worked with it, understood it, and respected its power. The rainy nights, the floods, and the relentless wind had tested me, but they had also taught me. And when I drove back to the town, leaving Rust behind temporarily, I knew I would return. The cabin wasn't just a structure of wood and nails. It was proof that even in isolation, with nothing but determination and effort, you could build something lasting and meaningful. I still remember the first storm vividly, how the rain pounded on the roof, the creek surged, and my heart pounded with it. Could have ended badly, but it didn't. I had survived, learned, and created something that could survive too. And that, more than anything, was the kind of clarity and peace I had been searching for in the chaos of the city. I had not driven down the old back road in almost 7 years. Not since the day I packed up my things and left my ex-wife behind in that small cabin she insisted on keeping. Even when life settled down and the anger faded, I stayed away from that part of the state. It was a narrow road cut between tall pines, the kind that felt too quiet, too shut in from the rest of the world. The place always gave me a strange heaviness, even during the years when things between us were still good. But on a cold October evening in 2021, after a long day of work and a long detour caused by a closed bridge, I ended up driving that way again. The sky was already dark when I turned onto the old route. The air felt heavier than it usually did in autumn, thick with the smell of wet leaves. The temperature had dropped fast, and the world outside my windshield looked like it had been drained of color. I could see my headlights making long pale streaks over the road, catching the edges of tree trunks and the wet shine of fallen branches. My hands felt stiff on the steering wheel, like I had to actually remind myself to keep them relaxed. I hadn't thought about the cabin for a long time, not seriously, but as I kept driving deeper into the forest, the memories came back in a slow, steady flood. I remembered the way the place looked on quiet mornings, the way sunlight cut through the trees, the way the wood creaked when the wind hit the walls. It wasn't a bad cabin, just an old one, worn down even before we lived there. My ex-wife liked how isolated it was, how it sat far back from the road, barely visible through the pines. I always had a different feeling toward it, something about the way it seemed to sink into the land, like it was settling deeper each year, like the dirt and roots were slowly pulling it inward. As I rounded a sharp curve, the shape of the old driveway came into view. The gravel was still spread out the same way, though weeds had pushed through thick and tall. I had planned to keep driving and pretend I didn't see it, but something in my chest tightened, something I couldn't fully explain. I felt a pull, not emotional or sentimental, more like pure unease, like my body wanted to see the place again just to confirm it was still there, still real, still as I left it. Before I even knew what I was doing, I slowed down and turned into the driveway. The tires made a crunching sound over the gravel, louder than I expected. It echoed into the trees, and the quiet that followed felt strange, like the forest held its breath. My headlights hit the cabin, and the sight of it made a cold pressure spread through my shoulders. It looked worse than I imagined. The wood was darker, almost black in some places. The front steps had sagged, and the left side of the roof dipped slightly as if it had been beaten down by storms. There was no light inside, no sign that anyone had been there in a long time. I parked a little distance away and stepped out of the car. The air was colder than I expected, and I could see my breath drifting into the night. The smell of damp earth was strong, and the quiet had a way of pressing in from all directions. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the cabin and feeling a strange mix of dread and curiosity. I wasn't trying to go inside. I had no reason to. I just wanted to look at it, to remind myself of the years I spent there and why I left. But then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. One of the windows on the side of the cabin had been pried open. Not broken, not shattered, just forced upward, leaving a dark gap beneath the frame. It wasn't like that when I lived there. My ex-wife kept every window sealed tight because the cold winds got through the cracks. Seeing that dark opening pulled me closer without me realizing I was walking. I moved slowly around the side of the cabin, my steps sinking into the soft ground. The grass was high, almost brushing the tops of my boots. When I reached the window, I noticed the marks on the wood. Long, rough scratches from something metal. Maybe a crowbar, maybe something else. I felt a heavy, uncomfortable pressure at the base of my throat. The cabin was supposed to be empty. She had moved out years ago. No one should have been here. Maybe some kids broke in for fun. Maybe someone homeless tried to sleep inside. But the forest around here wasn't the kind of place people pass through. It was far, hidden, and too quiet for anyone to wander into by accident. I stared through the window gap. Everything inside looked the same as I remembered, just older and dustier. The small table in the corner, the shelves she never finished building, the narrow hallway that led to the bedroom. I felt a cold ripple run deep into my back as I noticed something lying on the floorboards. Something out of place. A dark jacket, bunched up like someone dropped it recently. It had no dust on it. That told me everything I needed to know. Someone had been here. Maybe someone still was. A slow, crawling unease moved across my skin. I backed away from the window, trying to steady my breathing. The forest around me was silent, but not the normal kind of silence. This one felt tight, alert, as if the trees were holding something inside them. I knew I needed to leave. Standing there any longer made my chest feel heavy. I turned and walked back toward my car, trying not to make too much noise. Halfway there, I heard a sound behind me. Not a voice, not anything supernatural, just a single, sharp, clear sound of something wood hitting the floor inside the cabin. It echoed through the night in a way that made the hair along my arms lift. I froze for a moment. My heart thumped hard against my ribs. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The sound told me enough. Someone was inside and they were moving around now. I kept walking, faster this time, trying to keep my steps steady. My breathing felt too loud in my own ears. The cold air stung my nose as I reached the car door. I unlocked it, got in, and shut the door as quietly as I could. My hands shook slightly as I put the key in the ignition. The headlights cut through the darkness as I backed out of the driveway. The cabin grew smaller in my rearview mirror, and for a second I thought I saw a shift of movement near the front door, a faint shape blocking part of the frame. I didn't look again. I kept my eyes on the road as I drove away. The farther I got from the cabin, the easier it became to breathe again. My shoulders loosened, the road opened up, and the tall pines thinned until the forest gave way to open land. By the time I reached the highway, my heartbeat had returned to normal, but the feeling from that place stayed deep in me, a dark knot of tension that refused to fade. I didn't call the police. I didn't report anything. The cabin wasn't mine anymore, and I didn't want to explain why I had been there. I told myself it was probably someone passing through, someone looking for shelter. But even hours later, long after I got home and locked my own doors, the memory of that single sound inside the cabin stayed with me. The heavy, deliberate thud, the kind of sound that didn't happen by accident. In the days that followed, I checked online out of pure curiosity. Property listings, sheriff reports, anything. A week later, I found a small note buried in the local news. The cabin had burned down. No known cause. No one reported inside. No injuries. No arrests. Just a short statement already forgotten by most people. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I had left at the right time, and whatever or whoever was inside that cabin on that cold October night, whatever had been moving around in the dark, it stayed behind, and I never drove down that road again. I never thought I would get lost in the woods like that. It was the fall of 2007, and I had decided to take a solo weekend trip to the Adirondacks in upstate New York. I was 28, working as a freelance photographer at the time, and I wanted a break from the city. Some quiet, some space to think, some untouched nature. I rented a small, old cabin through a local agency, located deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. The drive up had been long, winding through narrow dirt roads and thick woods. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, spilling orange light across the tops of the maple trees, and I remember thinking it looked like the forest itself was breathing. The cabin was exactly as the ad described. Rustic, small, wooden, with a steeply pitched roof and a chimney that had clearly been unused for years. A thin layer of dust covered the porch railing, and the steps creaked under my weight as I climbed up. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and fallen leaves. I left my car at the edge of the small clearing and carried my gear inside. The cabin smelled of old pine and something else I couldn't place. Mustiness, perhaps, or maybe just the scent of a place that had been closed for months. I spent the first hour unpacking and setting up my small stove, lighting the propane heater, and exploring the cabin. There was one bedroom with a threadbare mattress, a small kitchen area, and a tiny living space with 2 old chairs and a wood table. Windows faced the forest on every side, and the late afternoon light slanted across the floor in long, dusty stripes. I liked it. I liked the quiet. I liked the idea of being completely alone. By nightfall, I was making a simple dinner and listening to the wind push through the trees outside. The woods were alive with noise, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, the distant cawing of crows. I felt a strange mixture of calm and unease, the kind that comes when you're alone in a place that doesn't see people often. I shrugged it off as natural. Around 10 p.m., I decided to turn in. The cabin had no electricity except for a few battery-powered lamps I had brought, so I relied on candlelight. I locked the cabin door, bolted it, and set my flashlight on the table beside the bed. I read for a while, the shadows of the trees outside scraping along the walls like slow-moving ghosts. I didn't see anyone, but the silence was heavy, almost loud. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach drop. A sharp, deliberate knock at the door. One knock. I froze, listening. The wind rustled the trees, but there was no other sound. My first thought was some local prankster or maybe an animal hitting the door. Another knock, this one louder, almost impatient. I stayed perfectly still, heart hammering. The cabin felt suddenly too small, too fragile, the walls paper thin. I thought about my phone, but I had no signal out here, none at all. My eyes darted to the kitchen knife lying on the table. I didn't move toward it. I didn't want to show fear by reaching for it. Instead, I waited. The knock stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just a tree branch or some wild animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I forced myself back to sleep, though my dreams were restless and fragmented. Shadows moving just outside the cabin, shapes at the windows that dissolved when I blinked. The next morning, I went outside to stretch, my nerves raw. The sun was barely up, and the forest looked different in the clear light. Nothing seemed out of place at first, just the usual tangle of leaves and underbrush. But then I noticed something strange. Around the edge of the clearing where I had parked my car, there were footprints. Not animal prints, they were human. Large, heavy prints running from the tree line toward the cabin, then looping around back toward the forest. My pulse quickened. I checked the cabin door, still locked. I checked the windows, no signs of entry. Whoever had been here hadn't tried to get in. But why were they so close? Why had they knocked? My mind raced. I grabbed my camera and walked the perimeter of the clearing, trying to take pictures of the prints. They were fresh, not more than a few hours old. I spent the rest of the morning on edge, every rustle of leaves making me jump. By mid-afternoon, I decided to hike back to the main road to see if I could get a signal. I didn't take my gear. I just grabbed my jacket and flashlight. I walked the small dirt path leading from the cabin to where it connected with a larger logging road. The woods were denser here, and every sound, branches snapping underfoot, the hiss of wind through the trees, made me nervous. Halfway down the trail, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone was standing between the trees, watching me. I couldn't see their face. They didn't move, just stood there. My stomach sank. I quickened my pace, trying to act casual, but inside I was panicking. When I reached a bend in the trail and looked back, they were gone. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. I finally reached the main road. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. It took a few attempts, but I finally got through and explained my situation. The dispatcher told me that the area was notorious for trespassers and hunters, some of whom weren't exactly friendly, but they were sending someone to check it out. I stayed on the road for nearly an hour before a sheriff's SUV arrived. We drove back to the cabin together. The sheriff's presence made me feel safer, but my unease didn't go away. He checked the perimeter, looked for signs of anyone still in the woods, and reassured me that the person or people had likely left when they realized someone was there. He even offered to take me to a motel for the night, which I gratefully accepted. In the days following, I learned that the cabin had been unoccupied for years and that local authorities occasionally found evidence of squatters or people using the area for illicit activities. I never returned to that cabin, and I always double-check locations now before going alone. I never saw the person again, and I never knew exactly who or what they were. But that weekend changed the way I think about solitude. It taught me that the forest isn't just quiet. It's alive in ways that can be dangerous when you're alone. The fear I felt that night wasn't supernatural. It was very real, very human, and entirely justified. Even now, years later, I can still feel the weight of those shadows, the eerie quiet that comes before you realize someone else is out there, watching, waiting. And I'll never forget the look of those footprints at the edge of the clearing, the reminder that sometimes the scariest encounters are the ones that are completely possible, completely real, and completely avoidable, if only you're cautious enough to notice before it's too late. I moved out to northern Arizona in the summer of 2016, looking for a place far from the city. I was 32 then, and tired of constant noise, traffic, and people who never left you alone. I found a small cabin tucked into a valley just outside of Flagstaff, surrounded by thick pines and juniper trees. The land sloped gently down toward a creek that ran all year, and the nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away. Perfect, I thought. Solitude, fresh air, quiet nights. The cabin itself was simple, built in the 1970s, with faded cedar siding and a small porch that sagged in the middle. Inside, the floors creaked when you stepped, and the wood smelled faintly of damp pine. There was a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom with a loft above it. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I moved in with a few boxes, my dog, Rusty, a lean, black shepherd mix, and my old Jeep. The first week was calm, the way I had imagined. I hiked, chopped firewood, and listened to the creek at night. Rusty and I were content, but it didn't take long for the quiet to change. I noticed it first one evening around 8 p.m., when the sun had just set and the forest was bathed in shadow. Rusty froze on the porch, ears perked, low growl in his throat. I looked out into the tree-line and thought I saw something move. Just a flicker, a shadow that didn't match the trees. I called Rusty, he obeyed reluctantly, and I shook it off as a deer. The next night, it happened again, but closer. I was sitting on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the smoke curl from the stove, when Rusty barked sharply, low and warning. I saw a figure standing just at the edge of the trees, motionless. I could make out a man-shaped silhouette, thin, unnaturally still. For a moment, I thought it was a neighbor, but then I remembered. No one lived this close. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the clearing, but the figure wasn't there. Rusty growled continuously for 10 minutes before calming. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the following weeks, the appearances became more frequent. I would catch glimpses from the cabin windows, something moving between trees, sometimes crouching, sometimes standing upright, but always disappearing when I tried to look directly. Rusty became increasingly anxious, refusing to leave the cabin at night, pacing, growling at corners of the porch where nothing seemed to be. One night, I stayed awake until after midnight, drinking coffee and watching the woods. I had a rifle with me now, just in case. Around 1 a.m., I heard it. A soft, deliberate snapping of branches, closer than ever. I aimed the flashlight into the forest and saw a figure stepping into the clearing. First, it looked human, but then I noticed the wrongness. Its movements were off, jerky in a way a person wouldn't move. Its arms were too long, swinging slightly too low, and it crouched strangely as it moved. My stomach twisted. I whispered Rusty's name, and he barked ferociously, running to the edge of the porch. The figure froze, tilting its head unnaturally, as if studying us. Then it vanished. No footprints, no rustle of leaves, nothing. I spent the next day checking the perimeter. I marked the ground where I thought it had stood. Nothing. Only deer tracks and the usual scatter of pine needles. But Rusty refused to leave my side. I started sleeping with the rifle under my arm, the flashlight at my feet, every window locked and barricaded with furniture. I knew something was hunting the cabin, or at least watching. Not a wild animal, not a bear, not even a mountain lion. The way it moved, the way it observed, felt deliberate. I started noticing small signs during the day. Logs rearranged, scratch marks on the porch, footprints that looked wrong, elongated, sometimes human, sometimes not. One morning, I found the chicken coop I had put together ripped apart. Not raided by coyotes, Rusty chased coyotes away regularly, but torn cleanly as if by a strong, careful hand. Weeks passed. I began hearing noises in the woods during the day, too. Twigs snapping, leaves brushing, movement just beyond the tree line. Rusty would growl and flatten low, hackles raised, refusing to step into the clearing. I had learned quickly to pay attention. I started carrying a hunting knife in my belt during hikes and made sure to leave markers on my way in case I had to retreat. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late October. The first cold snap had hit, and snow dusted the forest floor. Rusty and I were inside, the stove roaring, when I heard it. Deliberate, slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. My heart nearly stopped. I peeked through the window, nothing. But then I saw the shadows moving along the trees, stretching and shrinking unnaturally, as if something was shifting forms. I didn't breathe. Rusty growled low and continuously, hackles raised, staring at the tree-line. I grabbed the rifle, my hands shaking, and opened the door. The cold air bit at my face. Silence, then movement. A figure stepping out from behind a tree, pale, thin, taller than any human, hunched and jerky, eyes catching the moonlight like steel. I fired once. The shot cracked through the forest. The figure didn't react. My stomach dropped as I realized it hadn't moved like a human. It retreated into the woods with impossible speed. I spent the night in the loft, rifle ready, flashlight beside me. Rusty stayed pressed against my legs, growling softly but not barking. At dawn, I stepped outside. Footprints, elongated, human-like, but too wide, claw marks where the toes would be. They led away from the cabin and vanished into the forest. I didn't stay. I packed everything that morning, leaving behind what I couldn't carry. I didn't stop to look back as I drove down the dirt road. Rusty sat in the passenger seat, ears perked, occasionally letting out a low whine, staring at the tree-line as we left. I didn't return to the cabin for months. When I finally did, during the winter thaw, everything had changed. The porch was broken, the roof sagging worse, and the forest had reclaimed much of the clearing. The scratch marks on the wood had deepened, as if whatever had been there returned repeatedly. I realized then that I had been lucky to leave alive, lucky that Rusty had been alert. Whatever it was, it hadn't come inside, but it had been patient, clever, and dangerous. I decided not to rebuild. I sold the cabin quickly and quietly. The buyer never asked why I moved so fast, and I never told them. Rusty and I stayed together, but I never again stayed alone in a place so remote. I didn't need to see it to know it was still there. Every time I drive through northern Arizona, the memory of that valley, that cabin, that figure lurking in the trees, comes back. It's one of those things you don't forget. Now, years later, I still wake sometimes in the middle of the night, heart hammering, thinking I hear something moving just beyond the window. Rusty is long gone, but I can still see him, hackles raised, staring into the dark forest, growling at something I never fully understood. I know what I saw that night wasn't human, and it wasn't imaginary. I survived because I paid attention, because I respected it, because I didn't get greedy and try to confront it. Some things I learned are better left alone. I had never planned to stay in that part of Scotland. The Highlands were beautiful, sure, but I wasn't looking for beauty. I was looking for quiet. I was 28, tired of city life, and had found a small cabin for rent near Loch Tay. It was the middle of November 2013, the kind of cold where your bones feel frozen from the inside. The cabin was small, made of rough-hewn wood, with a narrow chimney that smoked lazily into the gray sky. The previous tenant had left in a hurry, the owner said, and that had discounted the price. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away. The drive up was long. Narrow roads twisted through dense forests, the trees bare and skeletal against the cold wind. By the time I arrived, the sun was already a dull, fading orange behind the hills. I carried my bag up a narrow, uneven path and reached the cabin, grateful for the solid wooden door and the faint smell of smoke in the chimney. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked, and the small windows rattled with the wind. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and something older, something lingering that I couldn't name. I shrugged it off. I was alone, and alone was what I wanted. I spent the first evening unpacking and making a fire. The fireplace was small but functional, and after an hour, I had warmth. I cooked some soup I had brought, and the kettle whistled softly as the flames danced. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, and I felt a thrill in the solitude. I told myself I loved this, the isolation, the quiet. But that night, I saw her. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke. I didn't hear anything unusual, just the wind and the soft crackling of the dying fire. Then I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, the dim light from the moon spilling through the small windows. But there she was, standing just beyond the nearest window. She was thin, hunched slightly, with long black hair that clung to her face. Her clothes were dark, ragged, and wet from the rain that had started falling again. I froze. The wind outside wasn't strong enough to move her hair or her clothes, yet she swayed ever so slightly, like a puppet on an invisible string. I couldn't move. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that maybe it was a trick of the moonlight on the wet leaves. But her face, God, her face, pale, gaunt, and wet, with dark eyes that didn't blink. She wasn't looking at me exactly, more like through me, like she was somewhere beyond the world I knew. And then she moved, slowly, one step forward, then another, and she vanished into the shadows of the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, listening. Every gust of wind made me jump. Every creak of the cabin sounded like someone walking through the trees outside. The rain pounded harder, and the roof groaned. Morning didn't bring comfort, only a gray, cold light that made the cabin feel even smaller. I told myself it was nothing, just someone passing by, maybe a local oddball, maybe a drunk who got lost. I wanted to believe that, but I couldn't shake the image of her face. The next day, I tried to keep busy. I walked to the nearby lock, taking pictures of the fog curling over the water. The air was crisp, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional bird. But everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. Branches snapped behind me. Shadows moved in the corner of my vision. And then I noticed footprints. Not the kind animals leave, but human footprints in the wet mud near the cabin. They were small, but they weren't mine, and they led from the woods straight to the cabin. I checked the doors and windows, locked them carefully, and stayed inside for the rest of the day. I ate cold soup and stared at the fire, watching it die. Around 6 in the evening, the sun dipped behind the hills, and the wind picked up again. That's when I saw her a second time. She was across the clearing now, closer than before, standing just beyond the edge of the trees. I could see her clearly this time. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, wet hair plastered to her face, staring. And then she did something that made my stomach twist. She raised one thin, pale hand and pointed at the cabin. I couldn't stay there. I packed a few things quickly, but I didn't want to call for help yet. No one would believe me. I decided to drive to the nearest village, maybe 20 miles down the road, and figure out what to do. But as I stepped outside, I froze. She was right there, barely 10 feet away, staring. And the wind made a noise like whispering, though there was no one else around. My heart pounded. I backed into the cabin, slammed the door, locked it, and tried to calm down. The night was endless. I stayed awake, listening to the rain, listening to the faint movements outside. At some point, I heard scratching on the windows, soft at first, then louder, as if she was testing the glass. I didn't look. I didn't dare. The fire burned low, and I shivered from cold and fear. I realized I had no plan, no weapon beyond a kitchen knife, No way to defend myself if she tried to enter. The hours crawled by. Finally, just before dawn, everything stopped. No scratching, no wind, no movement outside. I peeked cautiously through the window. Nothing. Only fog rolling through the trees, the damp ground glistening in the weak morning light. I felt weak, trembling, but I didn't want to wait any longer. I grabbed my bag, my coat, and my keys, and I ran to my car parked near the cabin. The tires sank into the soft mud as I drove down the narrow path, constantly checking the mirrors. I didn't see her again. Back in the village, I went straight to the local pub, hoping someone could tell me if anyone had been seen in the forest recently. An older man behind the bar listened to my story with a frown. "You weren't the first," he said quietly. "There's a woman who's been living around here for years. Nobody knows much about her. Folks say she doesn't like people. She scares them off." I didn't ask more. I didn't want to know more. I just needed warmth, light, and safety. I never returned to that cabin. I drove straight back to Edinburgh, avoiding the Highlands for months. But sometimes, even years later, I remember that night. The wet hair, the pale face, the hand pointing at the cabin. It wasn't supernatural, not in the stories you read about ghosts or curses. It was a woman, real, broken, lost, and terrifying in a way that no fairy tale could ever capture. And it made me realize that isolation can bring more than peace. It can bring something you never expected, something human and terrifying all at once. After that, I stayed with friends when I needed quiet, never alone in the woods. I learned to trust the city hum, the normal chaos. And sometimes, when the wind howls on a rainy night, I swear I can still see her, standing beyond the trees, staring, waiting. But I don't go back. I don't need to. It was the spring of 1998 when I decided to spend a week alone at my uncle's old farm cabin in rural Iowa. I was 29 then, fresh off a rough breakup, and I thought solitude among the rolling fields and creaking barns would clear my head. The cabin was tucked at the edge of a long, unpaved road, surrounded by acres of cornfields that stretched into the horizon. I remember driving down the narrow lane, the tires crunching on gravel, past overgrown weeds and a fence that leaned precariously to one side, the wire rusty and sagging. The air smelled faintly of wet earth, manure, and wild grass, a mix that was oddly comforting. The cabin itself was small, maybe 2 rooms in total, made of dark-stained wood that had weathered decades of storms. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows rattled in their frames whenever the wind picked up. Inside, it smelled of dust and old pine, with a faint hint of mold in the corners. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a rickety bed with a thin mattress, and a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a lantern on the wall, but I had brought my own flashlight and matches, just in case. The first night, everything seemed normal. I built a small fire in the stove, ate a can of beans, and listened to the wind through the cracks in the walls. The silence was different from the city. It wasn't oppressive, but it carried a weight of its own. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something dragging across the dirt outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. It circled the cabin once, then stopped. I stayed still under my thin blanket, my heart hammering, ears straining. Eventually, it moved away, but the unease stayed. The next day, I explored the farm. There was an old silo, partially collapsed, a barn with broken doors swinging on rusty hinges, and a chicken coop where a few scraggly hens clucked listlessly. I walked the perimeter, taking in the fields, and noticed the fence that ran along the property had several new gashes, as if something large had pushed through. I shrugged it off as deer or maybe a stray cow, but deep down, I felt a knot in my stomach. That evening, the unease returned. I was chopping wood for the stove when I noticed footprints in the mud around the cabin. Bare footprints, human size, but oddly shaped. They were smeared, like whoever made them had dragged their feet, and they led from the edge of the woods to the cabin and back again. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked, yet the footprints were fresh. My first instinct was to laugh it off, tell myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The following day, I tried to keep busy. I cleaned the barn a little, fed the chickens, and stacked hay bales, but the farm seemed different. The wind carried sounds that didn't belong. A low scraping along the metal roof, faint thumps from the barn, the occasional crack of a branch falling in the woods, though the forest was too far for that to happen where I heard it. Around noon, my dog, Max, who had come with me, froze by the cabin door, hackles raised, ears pricked. He growled low, a deep, guttural rumble that I had never heard from him before. That night, the worst happened. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to Max barking fiercely, the sound echoing through the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it across the room, catching movement at the edge of the window. A shadow, tall and thin, darted behind a tree. I grabbed an old hunting rifle my uncle had left, and my hands shook so badly I could barely hold it. For hours, I sat in the darkness, listening to every rustle, every crack, every breath of the wind. Sometimes I swore I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate, like someone was testing me. By morning, exhaustion had set in. I didn't sleep. I just sat with Max at my side, listening to the early birds and the wind through the trees, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But then I saw the marks, scratches on the outside wall of the cabin, deep and jagged, like claws had dug into the wood. Max growled, and I froze, realizing the scratches were fresh. Someone or something had been outside all night. I spent the next day preparing to leave. I packed my things, piled the last of the firewood, and checked the doors and windows. I made sure Max was leashed, and I kept the rifle close. As I walked to my truck, parked at the end of the gravel lane, I noticed movement in the fields. A figure crouching low, half hidden by the tall corn. I couldn't make out details, just the shape of a man, thin and oddly stiff. When it saw me, it froze, then ducked out of sight. My stomach sank. I drove off without looking back. Back in town, I called my uncle and told him everything. He listened quietly, then explained something I hadn't known. The old farm gets visitors, he said. People who used to live around here sometimes wander through. Some are harmless, some not so much. You did the right thing leaving when you did. Years later, I still remember that week. I never went back. The scratches are still etched into my memory. The dragging sound in the dirt, Max's growl piercing the night. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't some fairy tale creature. It was just a person, someone real, someone who shouldn't have been there. The farm, quiet and empty now, holds that weight, the way the wind carries the past through the fields. I never returned, and I never will. That experience taught me something simple but harsh. Isolation in a place where people used to live can be dangerous in ways you don't anticipate. No matter how peaceful a cabin looks, no matter how calm the fields seem, the presence of someone watching, circling, waiting, changes everything. It leaves you hyper-aware, always listening for a scrape of metal, a soft footstep, the sound of someone breathing outside your door. Even today, when I drive past rural Iowa on the highway, I glance at old farmhouses, old barns, and I feel a chill. I think about that week, the long nights, the dragging sound, the figure crouching in the cornfield. And I remember the relief I felt when I finally got to town, the warmth of human presence, the safety of knowing I wasn't alone anymore. That week at the cabin, alone with Max, became a lesson in caution, in fear that is real, tangible and lasting. The farm is still there, untouched by time, but I've left it in the past. Some places are not meant for curiosity, not meant for solitude. Some places are meant to be observed from afar. And the old cabin, with its sagging roof and jagged wood, will always hold a memory of a week when the world felt much larger and much more dangerous than I could have imagined. I drove north that afternoon with my dog sleeping in the back seat, his head pressed against the window like he always did when he felt safe. His name was Rust, a brown mixed breed with a thick coat and a calm nature, the kind of dog that made long drives feel less lonely. I had taken a few days off work because my chest felt too tight in the city, and I needed quiet. A friend had given me the keys to a small cabin in the northern part of Norway, not far from a lake that froze at night even in early autumn. He had told me it was simple, nothing fancy, but warm enough and far from people. That was all I wanted. The road narrowed the farther I went, turning from a paved street to gravel, and then to a path with more dirt than stone. The trees grew taller, thicker, leaning over the path like they were closing me in. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of sky that warned of rain but held it back long enough to make you uneasy. Rust lifted his head every now and then and sniffed the cold air drifting in through the cracked window. The moment I saw the roof of the cabin through the trees, I felt a small wave of relief. It sat on a crushed patch of ground, its wooden walls dark from years of wind and rain, the windows small and square like unblinking eyes. I parked close and stepped out. The air smelled like wet leaves and old pine. Rust jumped out and circled the area, tail wagging softly as he inspected every corner. I carried my bag inside and looked around. The cabin was exactly what my friend described. Plain, old, but clean. There was a stone fireplace on one side, a narrow bed on the other, and a single table with 2 chairs that looked like they had been there since the early 1980s. The place felt cold, not in a dangerous way, but in the way of a place that hadn't been lived in for a long time. I lit the fireplace, fed Rust, and sat down to eat something simple. By the time the fire warmed the room, the sky was fading into early evening. I stepped outside again just to breathe and let Rust explore. The forest around the cabin felt heavier now, the air colder. I could hear the faint sound of the lake down the slope, a slow and steady movement of water hitting the shore. Everything else was still. That night I slept lightly. Rust usually slept at the foot of my bed, but he curled up right beside me on the floor, close enough that I could hear his breathing. I woke up a few times without knowing why. Each time, the cabin was quiet except for the crackling fireplace. Around 3 in the morning, I woke again, this time because Rust stood up. I could hear his nails tapping the wooden floor. He wasn't growling, but his body was stiff, his ears up. He stared at the door as if he heard something outside. I sat up slowly, letting my eyes adjust. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no wind, no branches snapping, only silence. Rust stayed like that for almost a minute before he walked back to his spot beside the bed. I watched him settle down again and eventually fell back asleep, but a thin layer of unease stuck to me the rest of the night. The next morning, the ground was wet and the sky heavy with low clouds. I walked around the cabin to get a feel for the area. Rust walked ahead of me with his tail low, sniffing near the tree line. That was when I saw something strange in the dirt near the back of the cabin. Boot prints, deep ones, fresh enough that the edges hadn't softened. They led toward the trees and disappeared between them. At first, I thought they might be mine, but they were bigger, wider, and pointed in a direction I hadn't walked. I tried to push the thought away. Maybe someone from the nearby village had come through the area recently. Maybe a hiker. Maybe someone cutting through the woods. It wasn't unusual. At least that's what I told myself. But Rust kept sniffing the prints, following them a few steps before stopping and looking back at me. The rest of the day went by slowly. I chopped some wood, cleaned the inside of the cabin, took Rust down to the edge of the lake even though the water looked dark and unfriendly. The place was peaceful, but my mind kept circling back to the footprints. Each time I thought about them, I felt a soft pressure in my chest, like something was out of place. By the time evening came, the woods looked darker than the night before. The trees felt closer, the air thicker. Rust stuck to me more than usual. Inside the cabin, I closed the door, locked it, and let the fire build up. Rust lay near the door, not sleeping, just listening. I sat on the bed with the light from a small lantern casting long shadows across the room. The feeling that someone had been near the cabin stayed with me, sitting at the edge of my mind like a weight. Thunder rolled far in the distance, the kind that shakes the sky but not the ground. A storm was coming. Rain started to hit the roof in soft taps that turned into a steady, heavy sound. I lay down but didn't sleep easily. Rust stayed awake longer than I had ever seen him stay awake at night. It was around midnight when I heard something that made my skin tighten. A slow, steady crunching sound outside, like someone stepping on wet ground with careful steps. Rust lifted his head fast, ears pointed up, his entire body sharp with tension. I stayed very still, my breath shallow. The sound continued, slow, deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. There were no words, no knocking, no calling out. Just the sound of someone walking around the outside. The steps stopped near the window. I stared at the wall, imagining the exact spot where the person stood on the other side of the thin wooden boards. Rust growled then, a low sound deep in his chest, the kind he only made when he felt real danger. The steps moved again, circling the cabin once, then fading into the rain. I didn't sleep again after that. When the sun rose, I stepped outside cautiously. The ground around the cabin was full of footprints, fresh, clear, and not mine. They circled the cabin like someone had slowly walked around it more than once during the night. The prints were the same size and shape as the ones I saw the day before. Rust stayed close, scanning the trees with sharp eyes. I felt exposed standing there in the open. Whoever had been there wasn't trying to hide. They wanted to walk close. They wanted to walk slowly. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things fast, loaded the car, and called Rust inside. My hands shook as I turned the key. The forest looked different now, as if the trees themselves had been watching everything. As I drove down the narrow path, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Rust sat upright in the back seat, his eyes locked on the window, scanning the woods as we moved. When I reached the main road and finally saw another car in the distance, something inside me loosened. The pressure in my chest faded little by little. The farther I got from that cabin, the lighter I felt. Later that day, once I reached a small town, I stopped for a break. Rust jumped out, tail wagging normally again, his body relaxed. I sat on a bench near a grocery store, letting the sun warm my face, thinking about everything. There was no ghost, no creature, no tricks of the mind. Someone had been there, walking around the cabin at night, watching quietly. Maybe a stranger living off the grid. Maybe someone passing through. Maybe someone with bad intentions. I didn't know, and I didn't need to know. What mattered was that I left early enough, trusted Rust's reactions, and didn't brush off the signs. The cabin might have been peaceful during the day, but at night it belonged to someone else. And I wasn't going to wait around to meet them. That was the last time I stayed in a remote cabin alone. I learned that silence doesn't always mean safety, and footprints don't appear by themselves. The cabin is still there, I'm sure, sitting in the cold forest near that dark lake. But I will never go back. Rust and I drove away, and that's all that matters. We left that place behind, and I made sure it stayed behind us for good. It was the fall of 2014 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of my city life. I was 31 at the time, working as a junior architect in Seattle, and after months of endless deadlines and half-hearted weekends, I craved silence. I rented a small cabin in the Cascades, about 3 hours northeast of the city, in a dense part of the forest near Stevens Pass. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a weathered wooden structure with a pitched roof, a small stone fireplace, and a creaking porch that overlooked a narrow stream. No cell service, no internet, just me and the smell of pine and wet earth. I thought it would be peaceful, maybe even restorative. The first 2 days were exactly what I hoped for. I woke up early, brewed coffee on the small gas stove, and watched mist roll over the hills while reading a dog-eared copy of Thoreau I'd brought along. Nights were long and quiet, filled with the occasional rustle of squirrels or the far-off howl of coyotes. I slept fitfully at first and used to the sounds of the forest so close, but gradually I got used to it. The cabin felt like a sanctuary. It was on the third night that the unease began. I had gone out for a short hike along a nearby trail, bringing only my small backpack and a flashlight. The day had been cloudy, and by the time I returned to the cabin, the forest was dark and the air had a strange, damp chill that settled into my bones. I remember noticing that the stream outside the cabin had risen slightly, likely from a sudden rain earlier in the afternoon. I shrugged it off and started a fire in the fireplace, the logs sputtering as the dry wood caught. That night, around 11 p.m., I was lying on the small mattress I dragged into the corner of the living area, reading by lantern light, when I first heard it, the faint scraping of something heavy against wood, coming from outside. My initial thought was that it was a tree branch, maybe a fallen one brushing against the side of the cabin in the wind. But as I strained my ears, the sound became deliberate, slow, heavy, almost rhythmic. It wasn't a single scrape. It was a series of thuds, followed by long, dragging noises, moving along the perimeter of the cabin. I froze, heart hammering. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but bears usually make a lot of noise when moving through brush. And this was different. It was patient, purposeful. I grabbed my flashlight, careful not to make too much noise, and moved toward the door. My hands were shaking, and I felt the cold sweat slide down my back. I peered through the window and shone the light toward the edge of the cabin, but the trees swallowed the beam instantly. Nothing moved, and the forest seemed deceptively still again. I debated leaving the door locked and pretending I didn't hear anything, but instinct told me that if someone, or something, was out there, I needed to know. I opened the door just a crack. The night was pitch black, the trees swaying gently in the wind, and the stream outside sounded louder than usual, the water hitting rocks with a muted roar. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, just at the edge of the porch, I saw the outline of footprints in the wet soil. Large, human-like, and strangely spaced. Someone had been walking around the cabin, close enough that they could have been watching me without me seeing them. I slammed the door and bolted it, moving to pile chairs and the small table against it. I considered calling the police, but as I remembered, there was no cell signal. My breath came in short, uneven gasps. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and insistent. I tried to stay quiet, but the scraping returned, softer this time, like someone testing the windows, sliding something slowly across the wood siding. I grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen, my only weapon, and waited. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Every sound, the wind through the trees, the distant snapping of twigs, the gurgle of the stream, made me flinch. I wanted to sleep, but I couldn't. I sat against the wall, pan in hand, watching shadows dance in the dim light of the fireplace. Somewhere around 3 a.m., the noises stopped. Complete silence fell, heavy and suffocating. I stayed awake, listening for anything, until the first hint of dawn turned the forest gray. In the morning, I stepped outside cautiously, pan still in hand. The footprints were still there, clear and wet in the mud. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the forest about 30 feet from the edge of the clearing. Whoever had been there had left quickly, without any further sign. I inspected the area around the stream and the nearby trees, but found nothing else. No dropped items, no signs of a campsite. It was as if someone had simply walked in, circled the cabin, and walked out. Despite the terror I felt the night before, I couldn't stay inside forever. I needed to understand what had happened, and I needed to secure myself. I checked all the locks on the doors and windows, and this time I added heavy rocks and logs against them. I made a mental note to sleep fully dressed, near the fireplace with a large knife within reach. The following days were tense. Every sound made me jump, and every shadow seemed to move with intention. I explored the nearby trails cautiously, never leaving the cabin for more than 30 minutes, always checking behind me. The forest felt different now, oppressive, heavy, as if the trees themselves were watching. On one hike, I found more footprints similar to the first ones, only they led deeper into the woods and stopped abruptly. I spent the next hour scanning the trees, the ground, trying to figure out if I was being watched. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anyone, but I could feel it. The breaking point came on the 6th night. A storm had rolled in, heavy rain and wind rattling the roof. I was sitting in the corner of the cabin, pan in hand, when I heard the loudest noise yet. The sound of someone pounding on the side door. Not a gentle knock, but hard, desperate thuds, repeated over and over. My blood ran cold. I screamed, though no one could hear me, and hurled the pan toward the door. The pounding stopped. I stayed pressed against the wall for what felt like an hour, listening. Eventually, exhausted, I fell asleep, still pan in hand. Morning came, and with it, clarity. The storm had washed away most of the footprints, but I noticed a small detail I had overlooked before. A faint line in the mud, a dragged object leading away from the cabin. I followed it cautiously, and after 10 minutes of tracing it, I found something partially buried in the mud. A torn, muddy jacket that looked like it belonged to a man. Not a threat anymore, just a remnant of the previous night. That's when it hit me. Someone had been homeless, living in the forest. They had circled the cabin, testing whether anyone was inside, maybe even trying to see if I had supplies to steal. They hadn't intended to hurt me, at least not physically, but their presence had terrified me, and I realized how vulnerable I had been. I spent the last 2 days of my stay keeping the cabin secure, reinforcing doors and windows, and marking paths around the perimeter to alert me if anyone approached. I kept a fire burning at night, louder than necessary, to give the illusion of being alert and awake. And then I left. I drove back to Seattle, mud-streaked and exhausted, vowing never to underestimate the loneliness of the forest. Looking back now, the experience taught me a lot. I survived because I stayed calm enough to assess my situation, because I reinforced my cabin, and because I accepted that the danger wasn't supernatural, it was human, very real, and very close. I never returned to that cabin, and I never will. But I keep a flashlight and a sturdy pan in my apartment now, just in case, and I never take silence for granted again. The forest is beautiful, but it is not forgiving, and it hides more than it reveals. I drove into northern Montana in late October of 2017, trying to get away from the noise of my life for a few days. I had rented a small wooden cabin near the base of Fry Ridge, far from any town, with long empty roads and wide stretches of cold pine forest. I wanted silence, a break, something simple. The pictures online made the cabin look old but stable, and I liked the idea of being alone for a little while. I reached the place late in the afternoon, when the sun was already low and the trees looked darker than they should. The cabin sat by itself on a flat patch of ground, surrounded by tall pines on 3 sides. The front faced a narrow dirt path that ran down toward a dry creek bed. The wood siding was weathered, almost gray, and the metal roof had rust marks along the edges. When I stepped out of my car, the air felt colder than I expected. It wasn't the soft kind of cold, it was sharp, like it bit the skin. I stood there for a moment, listening. There were no birds, no animals moving in the brush. Nothing. Just silence and the soft hiss of the wind pushing through the needles of the pines. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small bed against one wall, a narrow kitchen counter, a wood stove that looked older than the cabin itself, and a single table with 2 chairs that didn't match. The floorboards were uneven, and every step made a soft creak. I checked every corner out of habit, even though I knew no one was supposed to be there before me. Everything looked untouched, except for the faint smell of old wood and something else I couldn't name. Something like damp soil that had been trapped for years. I put my bag on the bed and went outside before the sun set completely. I wanted to look around a bit, get a feel for the place. The sky was turning orange behind the ridge, and the air had that stillness you only get far away from people. I walked along the dry creek bed and saw old animal tracks hardened in the dirt. I'm not a hunter or anything, so I didn't know what made them. They didn't look fresh, so I didn't worry. As the light faded, the temperature dropped fast, and I felt the cold deep in my hands even through my gloves. Back inside the cabin, I lit the small propane lantern that came with the place, since the cabin didn't have electricity. The warm light made the room feel a little safer, but it also showed how old everything really was. The walls had gaps where you could see the insulation, and the door didn't sit perfectly in its frame. I cooked a simple meal on a camping stove I brought and ate it at the table, listening to the wood crack around me whenever the wind picked up. I kept telling myself it was just the cold shifting the cabin, nothing more. Later that night, around 10, I noticed something strange. Every time the wind blew hard, I heard a light tapping sound near the back of the cabin. At first I thought it was a loose board or a branch hitting the wall, but it didn't match the wind. The tapping was too steady, 3 quick taps, then silence, then another 3. I tried to ignore it. Old cabins make noises. I reminded myself that I came here for quiet, for space, and that I shouldn't let my mind turn simple things into problems. Still, the tapping bothered me enough that I checked the back door. It was locked. I pushed on it to make sure, and it didn't move. I tried to sleep after that, but the tapping came back again over the next hour, same pattern, same spot. 3 taps, silence, 3 taps again. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and kept my eyes on the roof. I didn't want to get up and check the outside. The bed felt like the only safe spot in the cabin. After a long time, the tapping stopped. I drifted off sometime after midnight, still uneasy. I woke up at dawn to the sound of something moving outside. Not the tapping this time, this was slow footsteps on gravel. It sounded like someone walking near the side of the cabin, stepping carefully, almost dragging their feet. I froze in bed. I listened for a long time, holding my breath. The sound moved from one side of the cabin toward the back. Then it stopped completely. I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something else. Nothing came. After a few minutes, I forced myself to get up and look out the front window. There were fresh tracks in the dirt, leading from the tree line toward the side of the cabin. They were human footprints, barefoot. The prints looked small, almost like someone with narrow feet had walked around during the night. The dirt was cold and hard that morning, and I couldn't understand why anyone would walk barefoot out here. I followed the tracks with my eyes until they faded into the shade between the trees. A chill ran through me when I realized the tapping from the night before wasn't from the wind or a loose board. It came from someone knocking on the back of the cabin. 3 soft taps, like they were trying not to be heard. I felt sick thinking about it. I locked the front door even though it didn't feel strong. I didn't want to go outside again, but staying inside didn't feel safe either. I kept checking the window, expecting to see someone watching me from the tree line. The forest looked still, untouched, but I knew someone had walked through it barefoot in the cold. Hours passed slowly. I tried to distract myself by reading a book I brought, but every sound outside pulled my attention. A branch cracking, leaves shifting, distant wind that sounded like breathing. The feeling of being watched grew stronger as the day went on. I didn't see anyone, but the silence felt heavier now, like the world outside the cabin was holding its breath. Around late afternoon, I heard the footsteps again, slow, careful, coming from behind the cabin. I stood still in the center of the room, listening with every part of my body. The footsteps stopped near the back door. Then came the tapping. 3 slow taps. I felt the hair on my arms rise. My chest tightened. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The taps came again, slightly louder this time. I pictured someone standing just outside the door, head close to the wood, listening for movement inside. I stayed frozen, hoping they would think the cabin was empty. After a long silence, the footsteps returned, moving away into the trees. I waited until I couldn't hear anything at all. I knew then that I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things fast, stuffing clothes into my bag without folding them. My hands shook so much I dropped my car keys twice. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting the tapping to start again. I walked to my car quickly but quietly, trying not to make noise. The trees felt too close, too dark. I kept expecting someone to step out from between them. When I reached the car, I unlocked it, climbed in, and slammed the door. Only then did I breathe again. I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, looking back once. The cabin stood still and empty, but the footprints were still visible around it, circling the place like someone had been wandering there for hours. I drove back toward the main road, and as the cabin disappeared behind the trees, I felt a huge weight lift off me. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small gas station nearly 40 miles away. Only then did I let myself think clearly about what happened. There was nothing supernatural about it. No ghosts, no strange creatures, nothing unreal. It was simple and terrifying in a real way. Someone was out there, someone barefoot in the cold, watching the cabin, testing the doors, tapping softly in the dark. Someone who didn't care how cold it was or how far they were from town. Maybe they lived in the woods. Maybe they were hiding from something. Maybe they waited until night to move. I don't know. All I know is that they were real, and they came right up to the cabin more than once. I never went back to that place. I never asked the owner about the footprints or the sounds. I didn't want to hear anything that would make it worse. The memory of those soft taps against the wood is enough. Even now, years later, when I hear something knock gently on a door or wall, I feel that same cold from the Montana woods crawl back into my chest. And the clearest part of the ending is this: I left that cabin alive only because I didn't open the door. Whoever was out there wanted something, and whatever it wasn't help, and it wasn't shelter. It was something else, something only they understood. I didn't wait around to find out. I made it out because I trusted the fear I felt. I never returned to any remote cabin again, and I never will. I remember the first time I drove up the gravel road leading to the cabin like it was yesterday, though it was actually the summer of 2014. I was 29, fresh out of the city for a week-long retreat from work and the constant noise of traffic and crowded streets. The cabin was tucked deep in the Vermont countryside, surrounded by dense woods and rolling fields. I'd rented it through a small local agency that specialized in isolated retreats, promising peace, quiet, and the chance to reconnect with nature. The photos looked perfect: wooden siding weathered to a soft gray, a small stone chimney, and a narrow creek running past the back porch. But reality always carries more weight than images. The road to the cabin was rough. My old Honda bounced over potholes and loose gravel, kicking up dust that clung to my jeans and hair. As I rounded the last bend, I caught my first glimpse of the cabin nestled among tall pines, almost hidden. A sense of relief washed over me. Even in daylight, being surrounded by so much silence felt unreal. The further I drove, the more the world of civilization receded. Telephone poles disappeared, and cell service dropped to nothing. By the time I pulled into the small dirt clearing in front of the cabin, I was almost completely cut off. Perfect, I thought. Exactly what I needed. The cabin itself was simple but sturdy. Inside, there was a small living area with a wood stove, a kitchenette, and a loft bedroom with a mattress on the floor. Dust covered some surfaces, but everything seemed usable. I set my bag down and walked to the back porch, the creek babbling quietly below. Birds chirped in the trees, and a warm breeze carried the scent of wet earth and pine needles. I unpacked slowly, letting myself sink into the isolation. For the first day, nothing seemed off. I walked the surrounding fields, noting the old fence posts leaning at odd angles, the rusted gate half swallowed by vines. Everything looked abandoned, but not threatening, just quiet. It was the second night that changed everything. I'd built a fire in the wood stove and was reading an old paperback I'd brought along. The sun had dipped below the tree-line, and the forest around me darkened to nearly pitch black. I could hear the creek more clearly now, and somewhere in the distance an animal scream, maybe a fox, maybe something larger. I had left the front door cracked for a breeze, and I was just about to shut it when I heard the first sound that unsettled me. The snap of a branch somewhere behind the cabin, close, deliberate. I froze, listening. Another snap, then the faint rustle of something moving in the underbrush. My first thought was deer. There had to be deer this deep in the woods. But the sound didn't match deer movements. It was heavier, slower, almost as if someone were stepping carefully, trying not to make too much noise. My heartbeat picked up, thumping in my ears louder than the fire crackling behind me. I told myself it was just an animal, but every instinct in my body screamed otherwise. I closed the door and double-locked it. The fire cast flickering shadows across the cabin walls, turning corners into dark, looming shapes. I tried to focus on my book, but every time the wind shifted, it brought in a faint smell of smoke. Not from the stove, something else. Burning? Maybe a campfire somewhere far in the woods, I reasoned. Still, sleep wouldn't come easily. Around midnight, the sounds returned. This time, there were footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Outside the window, I caught a shadow flit across the clearing. I could feel my chest tighten, the heat of panic climbing my neck. I thought about calling someone, but the realization hit. No service. Not a single bar. I was alone entirely with whoever or whatever was outside. Hours passed. I stayed crouched near the stove, a heavy iron poker in my hands, straining to hear anything beyond the immediate shadows of the cabin. Morning light finally filtered in, casting everything in a golden haze. I stepped outside cautiously. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of intrusion. My mind wanted to relax, to tell me it had been fear playing tricks, but deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Whoever had been there hadn't left evidence, not yet. The rest of the day, I avoided the forest. I stayed near the cabin, walking the fields that opened to sunlight. But by evening, the isolation pressed against me again, heavier than before. I had to fetch water from the creek and gather more wood. I tried to keep my movements deliberate and alert, scanning for any sign of movement in the trees, listening for the slightest snap. The third night was worse. It started similarly, with distant snapping and rustling, but soon became more tangible. I heard breathing, low, slow, careful, just outside the cabin. I couldn't see through the dark, and the shadows from my fire played tricks on my eyes, making every tree look like a looming figure. My mind refused to allow me peace. Every story I'd ever heard about isolated cabins in the woods pressed itself against my thoughts. By the time the sun rose, I realized I couldn't stay. My legs were tense, my mind sharp with paranoia. I packed what I could carry quickly, leaving heavier items behind. As I loaded the car, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt near the porch. Too large for any deer, wide, and with a flat human shape. They ended at the edge of the tree line, facing the cabin. Whoever had been there had watched me leave. Driving down the gravel road, every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made my hands grip the wheel harder. My mind replayed the nights over and over, analyzing sounds, shadows, shapes. I reached the main road hours later and finally saw other cars, people, civilization. Relief washed over me in waves. I didn't stop at a gas station. I drove straight home. It wasn't until years later that I pieced together what had likely happened. There had been a series of thefts in rural Vermont around that time, small-time burglars targeting cabins far from towns. They were known to watch, sometimes even staying in the woods around a cabin for days, observing patterns before making a move. The footprints, the sounds, the smoke smell, it all fit. They hadn't broken in that night because I had left too soon. But if I'd stayed longer, if I'd relaxed, I could have been in serious danger. I never went back to Vermont after that trip. I've stayed in cabins since, but always ones closer to towns, ones with neighbors or cell service. I've told the story many times, and each retelling reminds me of something I already knew but had to experience to truly understand. Isolation in the wilderness can be beautiful, but it can also be terrifying, and in moments like that, instinct is worth more than preparation. Even now, I remember the sound of the steps circling the cabin, the darkness pressing against the thin walls, and the heat of panic crawling up my spine. I remember the relief of finally seeing the main road and knowing I'd escaped. And I remember, most vividly, the lesson. The world outside civilization is quiet, but not empty. Something, someone, is always out there, and sometimes it's waiting for you. I never thought a summer job as a park ranger could turn into the kind of experience that would stick in my mind forever. It was the summer of 2007, and I was 22, just out of college, looking for some solitude and a chance to work in the wild. I had been assigned to a small, remote section of the Rocky Mountain National Park, far from the main visitor centers. My cabin, which I had been told was quaint but functional, was tucked into a clearing beside a shallow creek, surrounded by towering pines that bent and swayed like silent, watchful sentinels. I arrived in the early afternoon, my truck loaded with basic supplies: a propane stove, canned food, a sleeping bag, and enough firewood to last the week. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined. One room, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a rickety wooden table, a metal bed frame with a thin mattress, and a cast iron wood stove in the corner. The windows were dusty and streaked, the kind of dirt that collects from years of rain and wind, but they offered a clear view of the surrounding forest. There was a small, rusty generator outside, and I had a pack of kerosene lanterns. No cell signal, no neighbors. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the stove, cooked some beans over it, and sat by the window with a thermos of coffee. The wind rattled the cabin's thin walls, and the creek gurgled faintly. I felt completely alone, but safe in a way I hadn't realized I'd missed. By midnight, exhaustion took me, and I fell asleep to the soft patter of rain on the roof. The second day, things started to feel off. It began with small noises, a snap of a branch outside, a distant rustle that sounded almost like footsteps. I convinced myself it was deer or a fox, the usual forest wildlife, nothing to worry about. I spent the day patrolling trails, checking on small bridges and fire lookouts, noting a few fallen trees. I returned to the cabin around 4, tired, my boots muddy, my jacket damp. That evening, while I was chopping wood for the stove, I noticed something strange. The ground near the back of the cabin looked disturbed. Fresh footprints. I froze, stared at them. They were human-sized. Whoever made them had walked in a straight line, paused near the woods, and then disappeared. My heart rate picked up. I scanned the tree line, trying to convince myself it was some old ranger's tracks, left from weeks ago. But the soil was damp, and the footprints were sharp, defined, fresh. I spent hours checking every corner of the cabin. All the doors were locked, the windows bolted from the inside. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By nightfall, I had the stove going and the lanterns lit. The rain had turned into a steady downpour, hammering the tin roof and running in tiny streams down the windows. Shadows flickered across the walls as the flames danced. And then I heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping at the back door. 1, 2, 3 pauses between each knock. Not random, deliberate. I stayed still, listening, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was the wind. After a few minutes, it stopped. I didn't sleep well that night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept the door locked, the windows closed, and the fire going. The next morning, I discovered more signs. Items from my firewood pile had been moved. Not much, just a few logs shifted slightly, enough to make me certain someone had been there. I double-checked my map and my patrol routes. The nearest trailhead was nearly 2 miles away, and no one was supposed to be in this section of the park. I thought about leaving, about calling it in to the ranger station, but the nearest phone was 15 miles down the mountain, and my truck wasn't in the condition to handle the mud after all the rain. I had to wait it out. I decided to stay vigilant. I kept a pair of binoculars trained on the edge of the tree line, and every time I saw a movement, I froze trying to track it. For hours, nothing happened. Then, late in the afternoon, I saw a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A man, crouched near a clump of fir trees, watching the cabin. He was wearing a dark jacket, a hood pulled low, and he didn't move except for his head, which turned slightly as if he sensed me. I ducked behind the cabin, heart in my throat, and waited. Minutes passed. He didn't leave. I realized then that I had a decision to make. The cabin offered some safety, but it wasn't fortified. I couldn't call for help. The nearest ranger with a radio was at least 30 minutes away if I ran in daylight. I stayed inside, and the figure eventually slipped away as the sun began to set, the shadows growing long across the clearing. I kept the stove blazing and the lanterns lit, and I spent the night with an axe by my bed. Every snap and crack of the forest outside made me flinch. The following morning, the rain had stopped. Mist clung to the trees, turning everything silver and eerie. I decided to inspect the perimeter during daylight. My stomach was tight as I walked the edges of the clearing, scanning for tracks. I found them immediately. Fresh footprints again, circling the cabin like someone had been watching me all night. But there was something else. Discarded scraps of food, wrappers from trail mix, a torn glove. Whoever it was had been close enough to the cabin to know my habits. I spent the day preparing. I reinforced the windows with spare wood, piled extra logs around the door, and made sure the stove was always ready. I didn't leave the cabin again unless absolutely necessary. For 3 days, the pattern continued. Footprints, minor disturbances, the occasional glimpse of a figure in the distance. I started to notice that the figure only appeared during low light, dawn, dusk, or during rainstorms when visibility was poor. Whoever it was, they were patient, studying me. By the 5th day, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I realized the only way to end it was to move. I packed my truck with essentials and waited until dusk, when the figure was absent. I drove slowly down the muddy trail, keeping my eyes on the tree line. Every shadow seemed like someone hiding. Every rustle of leaves made me tense. But nothing happened. When I reached the ranger station late that night, muddy, soaked, and trembling, I reported everything. The team went back to check the cabin. They found the footprints, the food scraps, and several improvised traps along the paths around the cabin. It turned out to be a man who had been living in the forest illegally, watching for weeks. He was arrested within a few days. Even after it was over, I couldn't shake the feeling of that isolation, the weight of being watched in a place meant to feel safe. I stayed in the park for a few more months, but I never returned to that cabin. Every time I hike or camp in the mountains now, I check the edges of the woods, every shadow, every movement, and I remember that summer, the rain on the roof, the footprints in the mud, and the slow, deliberate taps on the door, a reminder of how fragile safety can be when you're alone in the wilderness.